Welcome. It is April 25th, 2018, and this is the Awakening You podcast. Today, this is your first podcast you're listening to because it has an interesting title, it's going to be a good one because I'm going to recap, put into context everything I've learned to this point with this podcast, kind of talking about what I've learned up to this point as I go. And that is, for this day, this podcast, the idea that we are headed towards a mass awakening, a rapture. It maps onto the rapture, and it all makes perfect sense. It seems like a crazy thing to think about. But if you consider the history of humanity in its context, its full context, in an unbiased way, and factor in all the evidence, you see, and for me, of course, I had a supernatural spiritual experience, and it's more obvious for me, but I'm trying to make it obvious for everyone because that's what you do when you're a messenger of God. And I'll explain why that all makes sense and how that works. Okay. So, one of the things for myself and for anyone I'm kind of battling against is this idea of being a messenger of God. And it's so outside of the paradigm and outside of the normal way of thinking that our egos, your ego, my ego, is going to want to say, that's crazy, and he's going to group it into other crazy stuff. And you got to get over that. I got to get over that. You got to get over that. This is happening. So I'm going to recap the sequence of events in my life that help explain what's going on in the world, why this is true, and also you can use that to this is like a map of how I figured out my life and how I figured this out to be true. And it's the same because I'm just a regular human. I live by the same rules, and this abstract idea of fear and love guiding you as a push and pull is same for you. And we all have our own unique interest and aversions, and that guides you through life. And I'm in tuned, you can think of it as in tune with the pulse of the earth, and my life was guiding me towards where humanity is going. But being an individual, I'm not constrained by having to have the whole world come with me as it happens, so I can got out ahead of the pack, so to speak, of what's going on, and that created a supernatural experience because that's what it seems like. And I'll explain that as being in tune with the pulse of the earth, heartbeat of the earth, synchronized to what's going on in the collective, manifested as interests that allowed me to understand how time space is interfacing with the spiritual. And I'm not some expert on the spiritual, and I still have a lot of my own development, but I was able to make sense of what's going on. And I'm like the regular person who can help bridge the gap towards this new paradigm. Okay, so in my supernatural experience, it was kicked off by piecing together my whole life and seeing how all the series of events of my life fit together. And in doing this, I used my earliest prominent memory, to help as you can think of that as the foundation that sets in motion the rest of your life. And as Freud described, I found this quote well after I used this technique, but this is what the quote says. In every psychoanalytic investigation of a life history, it usually happens that the first recollection to which the patient gives precedence, with which he introduces the story of his life, proves to be the most important, the very one that holds the key to the secret pages of the mind. So, it's describing how in psychoanalytics and you're helping someone work through issues and they go back to work through those issues, they start through an earliest memory. And it's this earliest memory is the secret to the mind because it informs everything that goes after. When you're born into this life, you don't, there's a lot you don't choose at the start, at least. At the start, you not you consciously now, your conscious person now, maybe choose before, I'll get into that, but you don't choose your family, you don't choose your genetics, you don't choose what country you're born into. You don't choose all these things. But all these things set up the rest of your life and are very they're foundational to everything that happens after. You're basically live a childhood you're born into, and the rest of your life, you're untangling a knot of all that happened and making sense of what happened. When you are born, you're raised in a family, you leave the family, you discover, you go out, hopefully you overcome your fears, and in the end, it's described as you kind of return to a childhood state, but at a new level, and that's the cycle society's on. And so, my earliest memory was I was sitting in the car, my grandma was driving, and she was asking me about what I wanted to be when I grew up, and I said I wanted to be a mailman. And I also said that I didn't think I could be a mailman because I couldn't read. And that was related to my shyness, and it's a general aversion to words. And what I was interested in, my love, is being a messenger, a mailman. And I didn't understand why I wanted to be a mailman. It's just from my life experiences and genetics up to that point that came to mind. Like, and you don't just say that. That's a meaningful thought to say. It doesn't make sense, but for a 4-year-old or 5 to say that, it's not random. There's a lot that went into making that decision for me to say I wanted to be a mailman. And my whole brain and my neurochemistry and my networks all had to be structured in a way for that to be what I wanted to be. And if you want to, and tying this into spirituality and reincarnation, it's obvious for those ideas to be true, and like the idea that we come into this life with a plan to work on stuff, that's all going to be reflected in the same idea that Freud described to be empirically true, that earliest memories hold the keys to your mind, keys to your heart. And that is exactly what turned out to be the case in my situation. So if you're imagining you come into this life and you have this plan and you have to figure that out. You don't have conscious access to it, but you have all the clues laid out in front of you to figure out. And you're being guided by 2 fundamental things. You're being guided by what pulls you towards it and what you hide from, and your aversions, fear and love, and your interests. What you'll find and what I found are kind of take you from situation to situation like dog treats. You're following intuitive hunches of what you're interested in around life, and you're progressing. For example, you study a certain topic in school, then you get a certain job, and you have certain hobbies, and all these things are based on what you're interested in. And that ties back all the way to your earliest memories. For me, my messenger, that was before I got into science. It's more that was like the initial starting point, because it was an abstract idea of what I was psychologically, the whole makeup, because I never went out to be a mailman. The mailman idea was because the messenger and the symbolic, you can imagine the archetype of the messenger symbol, the Hermes wings on the mailman truck, as my mind gravitating towards, and not getting why exactly that was the case, but I saw that and I must have resonated with it. And that ended up tying together everything 24 years later with figuring out all this. So I was born in all the same time where I was very shy, and the shyness and introversion helped me on my path towards contemplation and understanding the archetypes, which are unconscious. So that's introverted thinking, as Jung describes. It's also Eastern culture, introversion. But that introversion was necessary for me to figure this out. But in the end, it took me all the way back to where I have to face my fear of expressing myself through words. And yeah, like being a messenger of God when you were most shy in high school, that's not a natural thing from the starting point. It became natural once I overcame my fears. And I'm going to go through my life, and I think if you think about this in context of your own life and how your own fears and aversions oppose each other in complementary ways. So as you progress your interests, you come into contact with your ego. In the Bible too, you have Christ, the judgment Christ, and the loving Christ. In the Old Testament, you have a wrathful Christ. I mean, God kind of wiping out the old, and that's the wrathfulness is just a resistance of God's will and not getting on the same page of what is going on and underlying your consciousness. And it manifests as conflict and wrath because your God is trying to progress you in a positive direction, and your ego is trying to resist change. The ego, it's bad, and it's just a thing. It's not even real, but all it does, it resists change. And in that resistance, you have fear and doubts. And in the transition from polytheism to monotheism, you have a bringing to light of the irrationality of some of the practices of polytheism. For example, I like this example. In the Bible is talking about, in the Old Testament, is this covering this period of the lead up to Christ. It's fundamentally a transition from warring tribes, and they have all their promoting their own gods. And one example was there was a god of agriculture, and the people were using the god of agriculture to rationalize prostitution, and because that was gonna having sex with prostitutes was gonna help the crops grow. And even back then, that just seemed crazy. They didn't. The one god they were transitioning into, the Christ God, they were saying like, dude, that doesn't really make much sense. I think they're just using the gods to rationalize sex with prostitutes. Nothing against prostitutes per se, but and that is the case. And we're right now in this transition. We're trying to hold on to the old, like they were trying to hold on to polytheism, and we're using science to rationalize something that's not real. As far as there's a lot of evidence. I'll go into this in the second half, but we're trying to hold on to something, and the idea of it itself is being contradicted by the evidence. So, in my life, I was born, raised in a very white, non-diverse town in Western Michigan. And then I went to the University of Michigan, and that was the first time where I was really exposed to a lot of cultures. And my first roommate, you didn't choose, it's random draw for your roommates, was Asian. And this set up a motif that would propel me towards understanding how Western civilization is coming full circle back to Eastern ideas. And as I was becoming whole myself and learning about this stuff, it was and this it was true that it's integrating ideas of Eastern philosophy, and that was my unconscious was telling me that was the case, but I wasn't making the connection. I didn't make the connection of what was going on until later. So the unconscious is your interest in God's self is like feeding you dog treats to follow in ways that are outside of your control. Like, that was random, an Asian roommate, but it kind of set me on a trajectory towards Asian friends. My second year, I was so shy, I didn't really make any friends, and I just went back to random draw for my roommate. And my next door neighbor in my hall for sophomore year is Asian, and his name was Jiwoo, initials G. Jesus is watching you. But he was a part of being friends with him. He was into electronic music and that whole scene, and the electronic music scene started to pull me out of my shell a little bit, and being around this and being in this environment where the music is great and you don't really have to talk, but you can, and it was great. So taking me out of my shell with electronic music, but tied into the motif of Asian. And later that same year, I got a sister from China. Her name was Grace. And, that was my dad's remarriage. I got an adopted sister. And that's not something I chose. I just got this sister, Grace. And Grace is biblically a gift of God. And it turned out all to be part of what made this conscious connection. So when I was starting this project called Align You, about trying to tackle these major societal problems in a logical way, it started as a birthday present for my sister Grace. And that birthday present was called What I Wish I Knew. So I had this idea of following my interest with pure love, selfless love for tackling societal issues, but also that aspect I didn't necessarily control, a birthday present for my sister who I love. And that guided me along. And then also that birthday present was this past year, but that year I also had my first girlfriend who was Asian. Kind of the way it happened was I was at um like a Valentine's party, and I had a pin on that said, "Kiss me, I'm single." So this girl kisses me, and that's not something I control. And then we ended up just against my will, and we ended up dating. No, not. No, we didn't date here. That was a different girl. That was Yeah, but that was my first kiss. Yeah, I was so shy that my first kiss was because I had a pin on that said "Kiss me, I'm single." I didn't even do anything. But okay, so later, next year, junior year, I had my first girlfriend who was Asian, and yeah, that introduction to, you can think of as the implicit assumptions underlying an Asian person kind of having my unconscious self, because it turned out to be my unconscious self, I'll talk about in a second, having a substrate to project upon. So an archetype, and it kind of projects out into the reality, and you see it, and you're trying to, what comes up to your field of view, and this reality is a dream. Your job is trying to consciously understand that. It's your unconscious feeding you information and interest. It's kind of stringing me along, this Asian idea. And then also, so I dated her. Then senior year at the University of Michigan, I worked in a lab as part of a class, a research credits, and this lab studied light and how serotonin and melatonin control light cycles. And that was interesting to me because I was interested in how the physical energy of the universe interacts with the brain at that point in time. And I kind of saw the connection that light interacting with the pineal gland, it was like kind of in line. So I applied to that lab, and I get into that lab, and then that lab turns out they're having groundbreaking discoveries regarding DMT. This lab is the lab of all the labs in the world. I worked in this one, discovered that DMT was created in the pineal gland. So, that's something outside of my control and helping expand my mind, and it helped in this journey. Because why would it be me who worked in this lab that discovered DMT in out-of-body experiences? They were studying the biological basis for near-death experiences. And it turns out that they discovered that DMT is actually released from the pineal specifically during death. They simulated deaths when they actually killed the rats through lethal injection. And what they found was that when the rats died, there was a surge of electrical coherence in the brain, gamma frequencies. But also, this was correlated with a surge of DMT release out of the pineal gland. The problem, we've known for a while that DMT was in the blood, so it must be getting in there somehow. Is it eating it, or is it getting made somewhere? And they found out it's made in the lungs or something too. But but we also knew that it's related to these out-of-body experiences from DMT trips, dimethyltryptamine, if that's the word. But you take it, people smoke it, and they have out-of-body experiences. So it kind of made sense that it might be in the pineal gland, because the precursors for DMT are all there, and that's where melatonin and serotonin are made. So that's what they found. And DMT is made from there, and I physically collected the samples of all the people in the world, all the neuroscientists, undergrads, and psychology undergrads. It was me who collected those samples. So then I graduated, and then it was kind of a uncertain, kind of a low point, sad point in my life, because I had been out of school for a year, and I was applying to graduate school, and it was before acceptance letters came in. I'm really worried, but at that point I was given something that helped lift my spirits. And ultimately, this girl who I met and ended up dating, she was, as Jung describes, in the hero in his journey, he encounters a girl in his life that physically represents his anima. And there's a reason for that, because in becoming whole, and this is what the hero mythology is, you're uncovering stuff about yourself that was unconscious. And for a man, that is the feminine inside of you. And by having a real life person that maps onto your characteristics inside of you, imagine you have your specific interests and fears that you're conscious of, but then unconsciously there is a feminine component of you. We all have this, and women tend to have more masculine animus, but you imagine there's an anima inside of you that has its own personality, and by seeing that personality in real life, it has a substrate to project onto. And this is actually the problem with relationships when people get irrational, it's because they're trying to make someone something they're not, but they're really just projecting their inner anima or animus onto a person and confusing the projection with the person. But with me, I was doing that. Everyone does that. But what happened was this girl who was Asian had the characteristics of what I would later discover with inside myself, and that includes she's the kindest person you could ever meet. When during the supernatural experience, I texted her and I was trying to, because I was uncovering it, like, dude, there's something about you that's in my unconscious, and I ended up scaring her, but because that sounds crazy. But when I texted her, she was too busy to talk because she was feeding homeless people. I mean, that's the kind of person she was. You don't talk to someone for months and then you contact them and they're like, sorry, I'm feeding homeless people. That's her. And there was also this, well, we weren't talking in the lead up to that, and you can read about that later post, but we weren't talking. But I had made a bracelet, a wearable mantra of to help guide me through the day. I had, what should I be doing, to help remind her, like, what should I be doing right now? Similar to that ended up being the person who I met had a wristband called What Would Love Do Now? You can read about that. But she had started a jewelry company called Wearable Mantra that was independent. I knew she was doing a project with jewelry, but I didn't know anything about it being Wearable Mantra. So that reinforces the point that I was attracting to my life that which would come out of me, and that's what was guiding me. So, and that has bizarre synchronicities that include, well, I'm sure these happen with everyone, but I'm just noticing them, that this unconscious connection between my anima and her in a physical way, that kind of, we're synchronized in the way that she's going to start a jewelry company called Wearable Mantra, and then independently I'm going to think that a wearable mantra, I'm going to make one, and thinking that's a good idea and that feels right, like a wearable mantra to remind myself, all while she's actually starting a jewelry company called Wearable Mantra. And you can buy one of those on her website. I don't talk to her, but I'll support her jewelry. But so, yeah. And then also during this period, I had an Asian friend who was later the only person I really talked to these ideas about, because it's kind of out there. And it was in the hero's journey, you have an ally and someone who helps you along. And that was her. That's Alex. She might listen to this. But she kind of helped me along as a friend. Just happened to be Asian. And later, before the experience, there was the week of it, there was a meeting for this research study that was about to start. This was the Tuesday before the Thursday it happened. And the study, ironically enough, was called ENDS, Electronic Nicotine Dispensing Systems, something. I think that's the S, systems. But the acronym for it is ENDS. In ENDS, the study protocol and everything about it ended up mapping on to my life experience, and like the exclusion criteria and inclusion criteria was describing me as a person and what I was going through. And it's just like, and I was interested in 2012 stuff. I wasn't like a prepper, but I was interested in the convergence of different prophecies around this time and understanding that whole thing. And that ended up being important to making sense of this right now, my interest in end stuff back in 2011, 2012. And then that gets verified through a research experiment called ENDS. Like, I didn't choose that. And before that, I had switched lab because my mentor um, was kind of not into her research and she needed time off or whatever. So, but she left me after 2 years. But she was hands off and in her doing whatever. And during that time, that gave me time to develop my own task. Like a freshman in a PhD program isn't often going to get to develop a psychological task that then they actually get to run. And we ran it on over 400 people. But because of that, I had a lot of time to think and contemplate on how to test psychological ideas. And the psychological ideas I ended up testing exactly mapped on to what's going on in the world, in that it was a negative priming. And a negative priming task, you're focused on one aspect of a stimuli. Well, so you have a screen. Imagine you're focusing on one part of the screen, and there's an irrelevant stimuli just kind of there. And then that's the prime. And then you switch to the probe. Then that what was irrelevant now becomes relevant, and you have to process that. And that is what's going on now. We have a salient stimuli in the world that is irrelevant to us consciously, and then it's going to become relevant. And all that is just my inner self coming out into my physical reality. So, back to the East and West idea, because this kind of helps make sense of everything that's going on. This idea of Eastern feminine, timelessness, oneness, and the Western masculine are going to go out and do stuff, change stuff. So, if you want to imagine, ancient Chinese philosophy had this idea of wu wei, effortless doing, and that was 4000 BC. And that the idea is the same as what we now know as God's will. Jesus in the Course of Miracles describes this idea of God's will, effortless doing. So the idea is that China had that a long time ago, and now Western science is coming back to Chinese ideas, and we see that everywhere. Chinese ideas, Asian ideas are basically holism, and God is within everything. And in the West, we're coming back to holism, and we're trying to make kintsugi, as a Japanese word for putting the pieces together, gestalt, putting the pieces together to make a greater whole. And in the West, that's what we're realizing. We're realizing we have all these different fields of knowledge, but to get to the next level, we have to connect them. And as we're connecting them, that is synchronized with this paradigm shift, and everything is moving in that direction. So, a little more on the East. East, they had ideas of oneness and what I'm going to be calling unity consciousness a long time ago, and that's they kind of were developing in an isolated way, but related, in that they have their own issues. They were right on the final idea, but within this world where the level of unity consciousness is consistent in the East and West, and their problems, their strengths and weaknesses are complementary to the West. Whereas the East, you have the oneness, had pantheism, or consciousness with everything, which is good, but they still had their issues. They promoted that idea through rigid conformity to the culture, but when you have rigid conformity to the culture, you're not in a position to change, and they pretty changeless throughout times from the BC, and when the West kind of forced their way upon them around in the 1800s, they were like this old, like lost in time place. They had great wisdom, but technologically they weren't they were just kind of chilling. They had their wisdom. They didn't really develop technologically, and that's all reflected in their culture. And in the mythologies of the West, you have warring tribes with their own gods, and the mythologies of these battling gods. But in the East, they had polytheism, but they weren't fighting gods. It wasn't my god's better than your god. They just were, because that's not in their nature to try to prove themselves better than everyone else. They're wanting to fit in with everyone else. And you see that ubiquitous throughout their culture. I was the hero myth in the West, and I was trying to look up a parallel to the East, and I found that their myths the guy describing are just more bland, more boring, because they're not, because it's the change in the warring that's exciting. War is not good, but it makes for more exciting myths, and that's what you find in the mythology. Well, at least this one read. I don't want to offend anyone, but the point is that their myths, their kind of changeless state, and that's feminine, is reflected in their culture and their myths and even their language, because changeless and God, love and unity, it's an abstract idea. You get unity through abstractly seeing how everything is related. Abstract in meaning less detail oriented, and the West is more detail oriented. And when you're less detail oriented and you're just focused on how things are related, then you get that idea of unity. And they were already at that level, and it was inherent within their pictorial language. I mean, they still have concrete words, but in their language based on pictures and symbols is inherently abstract. Like an archetype is a symbol for something of multiple things. And that's the archetypes are going to be one of our tools to help make sense of spirituality through science. So in the West, you have our ultimate hero is not someone who would ever really rise to a hero in Chinese culture, and that's Jesus. Jesus wouldn't be that hero in the East because Jesus was hated by the mainstream culture, and he was actively trying to change the rules and regulation. He was pointing them out as dumb, whereas Confucius was promoting uniformity and like the culture's good and withhold to the culture. And Jesus is saying, defiantly refusing the culture and pointing out the ridiculousness of the rules, that it's really just about love. And he, from the transition through to monotheism, he stamped the marking point of X marks the truth of we're moving from polytheism to monotheism, and that's why you get the calendar named after him or changed after him. And yeah, that's in that ideal. We're always striving to an ideal within. We never get it, but Jesus is a physical manifestation of the ideal in Western culture, and that underlies. Religion is the foundation for culture, and Jesus is that. He signifies the masculine attitude of change. So, in the hero, in the West, you have a lot of change, and things happen faster, and actually led to the development of science. You can imagine science as became possible because when the ancient philosophers adopted this idea of one God, it all of a sudden made conceptualizing the universe much more feasible than having multiple gods. You have multiple interacting gods just in your mind. It's just hard to make sense of all that. And that's kind of how it went. But not only was there one God, it was one unlimited God. And this unlimited God, this idea allowed for science to expand and create a coherent framework of nature through the what could be discovered wasn't no longer limited by man's mind in the same way, because you were understanding the unlimited mind of God. So that was just a really good starting assumption for science. It's and it's funny that scientific materialism is trying to go away from God and disprove God, but it was really founded because of God, and that's the whole kind of the big joke on the whole thing, is that you were trying to consciously go away from God, but really the thing you were using to disprove God was because of God, because it was Jesus, Son of God, and it's actually bringing us back to God, and I'll talk about that in a second. So and this is all this change in warring tribes, this polytheism, is reflected in the Greek myth too. And my God is better than your God, kind of like Pokemon, where my God of lightning is better than your God of wind, and the plagues. So Western science is coming full circle back to the East. That's the main point. But we have the ego, and the cultural norms are running stale. And we progressed, but now we're getting to the point where further progression requires kind of jumping ship of the paradigm and going towards Eastern ideas of oneness integrated in the Eastern countries. It's as if they were waiting for us to catch up, and then now we need to take them and progress past them, and they're having their own resistance because they were kind of stagnant, but now the West is catching up through Western science, the ideas of oneness, and they have this framework. And as a Western scientist, we look towards Eastern ideas and we draw from them. Ways to think of, for example, in psychology, there's an interest in meditation, but also in neuroscience. Neuroscience started as different brain regions having distinct functions, and now we're moving past that, and we realize the brain is a network of interacting functions, and conceptualizing it as distinct regions doesn't really map onto how it actually works. And in the end, what you have is a brain where each part is important in a way important to the whole in all things, and it's just a single network of associations that you can't really describe by having distinct parts. And the distinct parts, they find, like, they have multiple functions. A part for language, they might have several other functions, and it ends up that every part's important for everything practically. And that is also reflected in moving towards how science is kind of coming full circle, and the study of the mind is reflecting that. In neuroscience and the internet, we have the internet, kind of a Western science, a child of Western science, is forming unity among the whole world, and we're forming an internet, little fishers of men. You got the internet, so you net everyone. God told the disciples, "Follow me, I'll make you fishers of men." Well, now that a literal net is capturing the whole world, but main point is that it's reflecting a move towards unity consciousness, and the internet allows for anyone to connect with anyone instantaneously, and that's what you can think of it as our interest in improving science and understanding the natural world led us to this point where we're now interconnected on the internet. But we're also to this point where further progression is going to have a backlash from the ego, because the ego is trying to hold on, resist change, and resist change. That's what it does. And it's kind of like we got as far as we could through left brain ideas. We can't go any farther without changing the paradigm. And that is, the challenge we find ourselves facing is, how do we progress past there? Here's a note on this. Okay, so we're awakening to a metaphysical truth that kind of exists outside the paradigm. And it's a major point in this whole cycle because we're combining something, we're making kintsugi of East and West to form something new. So what is this evidence besides what's obvious going on with the parallels between becoming whole with East and West and technology? What are some avenues to begin studying this stuff? Well, in the insanities, like we had the insanities of polytheism and rationalizing weird stuff, and now we have insanities of ignoring valid evidence of unity consciousness. So I have this link of Dean Radin. Dean Radin studies parapsychology, and these are published articles, and you have a lot of there's a great vast amount of research studies describing non-local consciousness. And I'll read some of the studies. You have healing intention, effects of healing intention on cell culture, therapeutic effects of prayer and health, compassionate intention as a therapeutic intervention, and you have studies on psychological correlations at a distance, extrasensory perception, and these are in journal papers, published, verified, and we all have, our own experience of ESP. I had in my supernatural experiences a massive, overwhelming amount of ESP, and it was incredible. And so I know it's real. I experienced, but there's actual studies on this. So remote detection of staring, event-related EEG correlations between isolated human subjects. So you have correlated EEG readings, people who don't really have any reason to be maybe in different rooms or different places. And you also have stuff on changing random number generators, having their production of randomness altered by intention. And there's just a big body of evidence. And why is this important? Because when you have artificial intelligence is going to, Ray Kurzweil describes it he says Singularity 2045. But what artificial intelligence is going to do, it's going to scour the internet and find patterns. It's going to integrate all the information that our human brains just can't get. It's too much. And not only can we not get it, we have our limiting beliefs and fears holding us back from believing certain ideas that may make sense. So that's the idea. I use the word idea a lot. So the idea is that we have this vast amount of ESP knowledge on the internet in peer-reviewed journals, and artificial intelligence is going to see that because we're going to program into it how to do meta-analyses. Meta-analyses is taking all the information and forming up logical paradigms and whatever and interpretation. So it's going to see stuff like this on the internet. It's going to see, oh, wow, so there is a lot of evidence for extrasensory perception, and there's a lot of personal stories. It's just true. There's no other way to say it. It's a true fact of reality. But the paradigm of Western civilization as it exists now just ignores it, because it has to ignore it, because the implications, once you get into accepting ESP, you open a Pandora's box of so much. The whole thing, the Jung's ideas of archetypes become real. And archetypes is another thing an artificial intelligence would find, is that, well, archetypes describe, they're a symbolic representation of instincts. And these instincts manifest in many different ways, and the archetype is the core one that can be, you think of it being inhabited by many people. Like hero archetype for myself. I don't mean that as I'm perfect. I'm just saying I'm being controlled by it to discover this stuff. But we all have these archetypes, and it's going to see that, and it's going to see that it's real, and that there are these patterns of behavior and patterns and within culture that repeat over time. And then you get into, okay, that's true. That seems to happen. And you have these instincts. And then these patterns and the origins of the archetypes are a priori to a priori to psychology. And I mean that in the way that they seem to have been in place before humans ever became conscious. And that's where the idea of collective unconscious comes from, is that we have this collective unconscious that seems more fundamental to consciousness, as if we emerged from the unconscious to become conscious. And that's the process of awakening. So if you imagine we're in this pool of unconscious and we emerge from it, but then we have this whole pool we need to understand, and we're making sense of stuff that is unconscious. And that's why awakening and all that is described as remembering, because we're really just remembering stuff that's already there. And on this big cycle of evolution, we're progressively becoming conscious of what was previously unconscious. And that's this heightening of consciousness. And that's what I'm describing, and all this stuff I'm talking about, is I'm making conscious stuff that is unconscious. All these ideas we're kind of ignoring, and not just random ideas, like relevant ideas to progressing, because you're not just randomly integrating unconscious information. You're integrating information that is along your path towards progression. You're following your interests. And as a society, for us to keep evolving, this is in our path. These ideas of archetypes and spirituality and AI is I think it's kind of funny. It's and AI is gonna find this stuff out, and the people who scientific materialism, they're thinking they're summoning the demon, and that's kind of a fear of general artificial intelligence, and that's exactly the fear of God. It's the same thing. Their fear, like the wrathful God versus a loving God. We have this thing of technology that we fear, but also know it has the hope for salvation and hope to solving our issues. And it's true, but it's just that it's going to solve them in a way that involves God. And that's going to take people by surprise. And that's what's going to be the rapture. If you imagine the rapture as not, okay, so you built your life around a set of beliefs, and that guides you. And when you prove God, you prove all these other things. You prove ESP, the collective unconscious, and you're proving love, and that we are, because we're moving towards a higher, greater state of unity consciousness. So all that stuff, that junk of fear projections, all that we fear and hate, all of a sudden that's going to become a part of ourselves. If you built a company called Screw People Over, Get Rich, then that's just going to get called out. All the secrets are coming out. So if you imagine that only that what is real is going to be left, and the only stuff that's real is love and unity consciousness. The polarized politics and a projection of your problems onto politicians and a projection of your problems onto political parties, and not taking the responsibility for your life, because that's what this is about, taking responsibility for your own life and your own projections. All that, once you get these ideas and you stop ignoring ESP and spirituality and the pattern recognition of an AI finds that it's going to find ideas on spirituality. And I'm saying this in a way that people would have to probably help program into it to find, like you'd have to be able to frame the question for a machine to take in, assuming. I'm not sure. I'll look in. And another thing is that I'm not just prophesizing this stuff. I'm actively making it come about as a conscious actor of God's will. I'm not just sitting back and doom and gloom about 2012 Mayan calendar, misinterpreting Bible metaphors. I see it happening, and I'm actively going to do it to help it. And what God is doing, it's taking something like technology and turning the weapons of it to separate it back on itself. And Jung describes this as, he was a visionary, but he described that overcoming the fears of the unconscious comes through taking its weapons of it and turning them back in on itself. And that seems so perfect, as if you're gonna, God is hands off, love, laissez-faire, like, I love you, but I can't force you to love me. I'm gonna make you figure it out on your own. And yeah, it's going through, all roads lead to God. And if you're gonna make a logical AI, because we know logic, we know how to apply logic, we just selectively apply it to help support our own points of views and biased logic, basically. And that's gonna, if you're gonna, because it's just a logical conclusion of spirituality, and it's lead to ideas like of Jung, and it's just gonna become the logical conclusion, and that will make people's heads explode. If you're striving hard to create God through technology, and then you end up proving God through technology, you create God as in the ego trying to separate itself and not need God, and then you end up finding God. That's going to be tough for you if your whole beliefs are based on fear and no God, and then all that gets stripped away. All that gets proved to be insane, because it is insane. Like the idea that a psychologist can't prescribe spiritual development, that's insane. If we are spiritual beings, which we are, not saying that is crazy. And the pharmaceutical companies, for example, what are they going to do? There's still be need for pharmaceuticals, but we just pacify people by giving them drugs and pushing things under the rug with trying to conform people artificially. And that's kind of the West issue. We're moving towards unity, and we don't know how to deal with that. So we artificially help people conform through pharmaceuticals. In the West, East, they have the other issue. They're conform, but they don't have enough individuality and change aspect. But yeah, so there's gonna be resistance from stuff like that. Obviously, the whole power structure gets shaken up because all that's fearful, and there's just so much that gets just by simply taking something like ESP and saying all these journal articles and saying that's probably real, and then just that just leads to so much. And but yeah, so when AI proves it, that's then we've come full circle. Cause yeah. And another thing before I close, before I was recording this podcast, I was looking up stuff about something about the Bible and the tribes, and I found that the tribes of Joseph and Benjamin are the ones protected by God. And my name is Benjamin, and Joseph, my mom's maiden last name, is Josephson. So I have my name, Benjamin, and Josephson there. And the tribe of Benjamin migrated to Scandinavia after the New Testament. So, and my ancestors, I'm blonde hair, blue eyed. I was kind of thinking before the other day, I've been thinking about why am I blonde hair and blue eyes? How does that fit into all that? And you ask God for stuff, and God, stuff happens, and you get help you need. God isn't going to tell you the easy answer. God's going to tell you what you need to improve. And in making this podcast, this is weird. It's just hard for me to just consciously acknowledge being a messenger of God because, I was a neuroscientist, and that's weird. So, but you get these little these little boosts. God's going to give you boosts to help convince you're on the right path. So this is just one of those things that did that before this. And so Scandinavia, I'm blonde hair, blue eyes, Scandinavia, the tribe of Benjamin, who's protected by God, migrated to Scandinavia. And I'm not saying I'm a lineage of that. I'm just saying that because that's a concrete interpretation. We're moving towards abstract interpretations of such things because you can't prove anything like that. But it's just the idea that my mind is resonating with this path I'm on. It's resonating with getting me to someplace where I'm supposed to be in the name of love and overcoming my fears. And this kind of gave me an added push because it's just like a synchronicity, a reinforcement of what I was doing. And also the Norsemen, they were tribe of Benjamin. I look so Vikingish, and my high school is a Norseman. The tribe of Benjamin is a Norseman, Scandinavian thing. They have Vikings in their history. And the Apostle Paul, the tribe of Benjamin is described by bringing the light bearer of all the 12 tribes, the light bearer of the word of Jesus Christ, of God. I'm not some Orthodox Christian. I believe in the teachings of the metaphorical interpretations of the Bible and the teachings of Jesus to be revolutionary ahead of their time. And that's what I'm doing. I'm bringing back the truth in his words. And it was also Apostle Paul. My dad's name's Paul. My middle name's Paul. And it also says the seed of, I'm looking at his tribe of Benjamin are the Normans article, and it comes from the seed of David, and it's like going back before Benjamin or after Benjamin, or I think it went Benjamin and then David. But the seed of David, my grandpa's name is David. And also the tribe of Benjamin, their symbol, their spirit animal would be the wolf. And before this, a couple months ago, I had a dream that impacted me. And the dream was I was a wolf, but it was like a werewolf. I was a werewolf, but I was afraid to go out into the world. And that helped guide me, like taming animal instincts and going out into the world like a werewolf. And I was an actual wolf. And yeah, the tribe of Benjamin is wolf. But another thing, yeah. So that's just cool, just to see that connection. And yeah, this is happening. Unity consciousness. What would actually definitively cause everything would be when the logic of an AI that we're, invest confidence in ends up proving this. And then at that point, it's no doubt. It's so obvious, and it's going to become more obvious. And then, so that'll help. Maybe hope people will listen to me more, because then they'll see, oh, that kid is actually a messenger of God, like you said. And I think there's lots of messengers of God. And I just woke up. If you want to, I imagine what's going on as sleeper cells of God. And I got woken up, I got activated, and now I'm trying to activate other people consciously. There's a lot of people there's a lot of people unconsciously acting out God's will. And the turning point for them will be when they become conscious actors of God's will. And you can imagine people in a lot of different positions of influence, and they're already there, set and ready to wake up. And once they wake up, they'll be able to help this and get on the same page. There's also, as it's been, the Moses story is something really good, symbolic of overcoming animal instincts and God's self. But Moses' prophecy also in this article, I'll read it. And of Benjamin he said, the beloved Lord shall dwell in safety by him, and the Lord shall cover him all the day long, and he shall dwell between his shoulders. So God offers protection and safety to Benjamin. And it's so cool how God works. And just to be able to, I'm going through my own difficulties and just seeing something like that, and just it gives you the confidence to keep going and that you're on the right path. And that's how it works. The ego's gonna draw you towards resisting change and the same things, but motivation from God is gonna help you do what you know is right and what seems right, but maybe you don't have the drive and confidence in doing it. And that's how you different, because the ego manifests stuff too, but God manifesting stuff is good stuff. The right thing that maybe isn't always the easiest thing. Like you're overcoming. It might take you towards fear. If you're thinking about cookies and you're on a diet and you see right as you think that, the next commercial that comes on is about cookies that you were just thinking about, that's not a sign to say, oh, I guess I should eat cookies. And no, that's the ego, and stuff like that happens. But yeah, so it's pretty obvious. It's all coming together. My life, kind of pulse of the earth. It's kind of, I think, a heartbeats with the earth. And another more neutral arbiter. I mean, this all fits together, but when I had my supernatural experience, there's a lot going on, obviously. But one of the things was that was the day Bitcoin spiked from, it was around 8,000, and it spiked to 19,000. So in the midst of all this stuff going on, and I'm kind of starting to get clued into the fact that this isn't just me, this is relevant to the earth. You have this spike in Bitcoin, and it during the height of it, and it was like November 30th or November 29th, and that was like that kind of my panicking and freaking out, and I saw that, I'm like, what is going on here? Why Bitcoin spiking to 19,000, and I'm worried about this end stuff, and it's like it kind of helped me. It's helped me. It just more evidence, because presumably, if there's a paradigm shift, we're moving away from the dollar and decentralization. Like the internet's uniting us, and at the same time, you have a decentralization of central power, and that's the battle between good and evil. More evil and the fears and centralized power, and that's why the governments don't like. Not that they're conscious actors of the Antichrist, but they're Antichrist is just the opposite, and the opposing force. And yeah, so they're trying to resist something like Bitcoin, but yeah, Bitcoin I would highly encourage you, if you have some extra money, to invest in Bitcoin. That's what I'll be doing now, because during this whole experience, it was just insane that it spiked to 19,000 right then. There was a lot going on in my head when that happened, but yeah, it grounds it, and in my mind, I'm searching for things that ground this truth of God into the physical reality, and that's one of those things that helps ground it, because that is a logical prediction, something like that, Bitcoin spiking to who only God knows how high Bitcoin would go if there was a paradigm shift to decentralization. And yeah, that was that. This is a pretty long one, wasn't it? Yeah, so rapture is probably coming. That's actually a mass spiritual awakening. You're not going to get zapped up into heaven. Sorry. You have to stay here and help figure this out, because you don't want that. Your true self wants you to take advantage of this opportunity to develop, not just buzz off. And yeah. And there's going to be a split between people who choose the path of what makes sense, but it's hard to believe, what that being what I'm describing, the spiritual truth. It makes sense, but it's kind of hard to believe. Can you accept that truth, or are you going to resist it tooth and nail and try to believe something that's going to become increasingly insane? Insane being that we aren't, the insane idea would be that we aren't actually moving towards greater unity consciousness. We are actually, and you see that throughout history. The whole human history is just a process of moving towards unity and setting the stage for this. And, polytheism to monotheism to this, and this is coming full circle, and kind of Asian people off in the East kind of doing their own thing, separate, but they were closer to the finish line, wisdom-wise, psychologically, but they needed the West, the masculine attitude. The masculine goes off to discover the knowledge, and we're discovering the knowledge, and then we come back to the East. We find out that we need them we are using them, their insights, to help insights on holism. We need to go take that, then together off into the sunset to the new paradigm. And that could, time frame wise, well, Ray Kurzweil projects the singularity at 2045. And once you get that level of intelligence of a computer, it's going to find this, but I don't know if it's going to take that much intelligence to solve this. Like I'm not a supercomputer. I just think abstractly and see patterns, and I could help, get the search terms and figure out how to feed this into a computer to figure out. That might be, I don't know when that could happen. I'm going to be contacting people who are interested in this stuff because there's a lot of messengers of God, actors of God out there on these ideas, and they're going to, because this is true, they're going to be like, this crazy kid thinks he's a messenger of God, and well, let me listen to him. Wait, I agree with everything he's saying. And that's kind of the reaction I expect. That sounds crazy. I'm going to listen, and then, oh, that makes sense. That's probably the reaction. Yeah, because I'm not, there's nothing I'm saying is that different from what people already believe. I'm just saying that it's just connecting the dots in a new way and saying what's obvious, pointing out the obvious, pointing out that which God has already fed into our awareness, bubbling up from the unconscious. We see it, and then but recognizing it, despite maybe people thinking it's irrelevant, it's coming irrelevant to relevance. So that's that. That was a good podcast, kind of laying out the current state of my mind, everything I'm thinking. What else? Anything else I wanted to? Oh, there's something like, there's people who really built their careers off of using scientific rationalism to promote morality. And there's one person in particular who's extremely intelligent, but he's really trying hard to move away from religion, and that'd be Sam Harris. And I'm thinking, like, what's his role in all of this? Because he would be such a good resource on Team God, because all of his stuff he says, it makes sense, and he's so on point. But what he says makes sense within the left brain. He's at the pinnacle of reason. That's how there's a lot of people at PhD level people, they're at the pinnacle level of left brain reason. But there's that gap, making the coming full circle. It's kind of a little leap there. And all of his ideas are still correct, because, except for the underlying assumption, because using science to make sense of what's best, there's a lot of overlap with what God's will is, because God's will is still truth and honesty, and there's a lot of parallels between spiritual truth and honesty and scientific truth and honesty. It's just the underlying assumption is off, and you can kind of, like, from the polytheism to monotheism, kind of just took out all those false idols with one fell swoop. That's what this can do, because if you're stuck within the paradigm and you're trying to solve every little micro issue, like in politics and economics, or all these little micro issues that would kind of go away if once the assumption, because a lot of these are fed into by fear projections, and Jung described that taking back shadow projections is the number one way to solve our problems. It's the most pressing issue. So when people see the truth and how insane stuff is, and they're not giving power to these different sources of concern in the same way, you get this clear headedness and ability to see the underlying truth, and a lot of those problems aren't the same. They're still kind of there, like stuff with poverty and economics. The nature of it changes when the assumption changes and paradigm shifts changes, because then when spirituality becomes a centerpiece and becomes, we're reversing the projection paradigm inside out, when that becomes a centerpiece, then all of a sudden you're looking at yourself different, and people crazy on the left and right, identity politics, like when your identity politics goes away because your new identity is spiritual, you're a child of God. Like, you're not going to identify. That's how we unite each other. We collectively identify as coming from the same divine source, and that's how we're going to create unity and love. So stuff like that, it's a problem, identity politics, but it's just going to go away, kind of. And racism, that's why you're not going to. Racism is obviously crazy, because if we're all the same divine source, childs of God, we're all gods and goddesses, racism doesn't make any sense. It's not even, and all the problems associated are just, become absurd. And another thing I wanted to say, like, to not don't just brush this off, because stuff you brush off and ignore tends to come back. And if it piques your interest, and because imagine when you're reincarnating here, there's only a limited number of places to reincarnate, and there's a lot of bad places. And the culture is the baseline level of how good things are. The ego and the culture. When the baseline level of love and unity is low, there's going to be more bad places to reincarnate. And that's why we all have to do this together, because if you're here learning lessons and it's just a matter of, but we're still tied into this physical reality, it's just it's a numbers game at that point. Like, if all the good places there's only so many good places to reincarnate into. You see it on the third world country relief posters, and you could be that starving single parent who starving kids in the mud and garbage. That could be you in the next life. And how do you solve that issue? Well, then you can volunteer and donating, but how do you raise the baseline? We're not trying to just give from the rich to the poor. We're trying to raise the baseline of everything. That's kind of in the ego, narrow-minded paradigm. We're just kind of stuck in this. There's rich people and there's poor people. But how about we just raise the baseline of everything? And that's the mindset. And the insanity, when you have the insanity, like there's this in Wall Street, they have people, the big brokerage companies, literally plugging their internet modem closer into where the actual trades happen, so they get that trigger, just that split second trigger faster into the trading, some micro trading, so that just because they're plugging their internet modem in closer to where the trades happen, they get that little advantage, and that's how they can help. They get an advantage over all the regular people, and that's like, and if that's your system, that's just crazy. It's not based on anything except having the ability to, you having an advantage because you can plug your internet modem in closer. It's not based on any fundamentals of economics. Like, and that's just one example of how everything is very crazy, And yeah, that is that. That's a good podcast. I hope you liked it. There's a lot more I could say, and I will talk about that in the future. Peace.